should Muslims be able to live in Christian societies?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sure.
What are your arguments against this? Okay, let me play devil's advocate right now. Let's say in the Old Testament, you had a state religion. You had only one type of worship allowed within the nation of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And Deuteronomy is a book that's about the covenant for the nation of Israel, yes, but it's also a law that has principles that apply for all time everywhere. Therefore, if we have countries that are Christian in substance, meaning that like lots of people here are Christian to the extent it affects our laws and culture, therefore we should not allow false worship of and incorrect religions in our countries as Christians. How would you guys answer that biblically?
I mean, even in the passages that you're talking about in the Torah, there are allowances made for people who are from the nations living within the nation. But those people have joined themselves to Israel, right? So essentially, they're not second-class citizens. You know, it says when they left Egypt, a mixed multitude went out with them. So Egyptians left with them and were gradually like assimilated into the nation. That being said, you know, I think that the difference in what you're talking about biblically and where the world has kind of evolved, like all of that went out in the Renaissance, right? Where, you know, you started rejecting like Christian states or Catholic states and pushing away from that idea and developing, you know, like let's just say like the French concept of democracy that, you know, later was like, you know, adapted throughout Europe. So, and, you know, in England and different places, but
that did not come from France and England.
I think the idea is
it came from Greece, but I'm saying that like in modern times, you had the Renaissance, right? Which pushed away from aristocracies and religious states. And like, I am the, you know, the king of this because I'm God's person sitting on a throne, right? Like it started to develop like parliamentary systems and all this other stuff.
I would make the argument that the reason that stuff developed was not really due to is not so much to do with the Renaissance, but the Reformation.
No, I would agree with you, but I would say like so the secular world is not looking at the Reformation. They're looking at like the French Revolution.
Sure, and that's part of the problem.
Yes, it is part of the problem. Absolutely. Right? Like off with your head is
Yeah. So the model of government we have really comes from Geneva, Switzerland, through Scotland, then to England through Presbyterian. And the system of government in the sort of turn of the Reformation in England was called popular sovereignty.
Right.
And it's that Puritan worldview which believed in the kingship of all believers, that every individual has a sense of sovereignty in their lives, and that the king should be under the law, right? The republic is not direct democracy. The people have a voice, but God's voice is supreme, and that voice is represented by the law.
Right.
So we don't just vote for everything in our countries. There is supposed to be a certain sense of, you know, what the standard is, right? And if a nation is Christian, that standard is going to reflect Christian principles.
Yes. And I mean, as far as Muslims, you know, coming to those places, I mean, I wouldn't say when we came in the 70s that when my family came here in the 70s that America was a devoutly Christian nation, but it was still, you know, Christianity is still like the major religion here in this country. And there was an immigration process and we went through it. I'm going to be controversial here. I think all Muslims can live here and everyone's welcome, but I don't think all Muslims should live here. Because I think that it's, you know, if you have a certain worldview and you don't like the way things are here, you know, and you want to impose your will in you know, different communities and stuff like that, or you don't want to abide by the laws because you think that your laws supersede the laws of the country, then this is probably not the best place for you, because we don't practice like our society like that. I mean, it's you can't like. I don't want to be extreme in my example, but like female genitalia mutilation, right? That's practiced in some countries in Islam. It's an extreme, but you can't do that here, right?
Let's take an easier case, like polygamy.
Yeah, polygamy. You can't do that here, right? And there are certain things that are just never going to flush here, because they're against the law. And it's one thing to sit here and say like the law is unjust and we should change it. You know what I mean? Like that's how the system's hopefully built and how it hopefully executes. If there's injustice, the system can be changed by the population. But certain things are just not like. I don't want to sound exclusive. I don't know exactly what I'm saying. I just don't think that like it's a great fit for everyone, right? And it would be the same for me. If I went to China, I would not be a great fit in China. Like I'm like so all about like my individual rights and liberties. And in China, those things are dictated to you, right, mm-hmm. by the state. So it wouldn't be a good fit for me, right? That's not to denigrate China or the Chinese. It's just to say it's not a good fit for me. So
yeah, I think there are two things. First, I agree with you should be living where you find yourself fitting in that. But again, the question which is more appealing to me is how we define the law and who defines the law. Is the law divine, or it's the group of people deciding what type of laws or what type of regulations they want to imply on themselves? So the law, in my opinion, is not something that you cannot change over time. It's just how people see themselves fitting in that, and that keep changing, right?
Right.
But let's for the sake of this conversation, right, we're talking more about the biblical law and its application. Mm-hmm. So if we have a button we can push, which makes the ideal law using biblical principles, the question becomes, what happens to people who are non-Christians, specifically Muslims, in that society?
I mean, I think that I would like to think that, love your neighbor as you love yourself. The Bible, particularly the New Testament, doesn't call for like, let's burn down any, like you're supposed to like respect your neighbor, so let's like, if they build a mosque, burn it down. It doesn't say that anywhere, right? Like it doesn't say that if they worship another god, go out and slay them, like it doesn't say that in the New Testament. I mean, there's certainly cases of it in the Old Testament, but you have to look at Israel a little bit differently than, because Israel, like at that point, God is trying to do something very specific, and he's starting a process that's very specific that leads to Jesus. So that's where he did it.
And even in the Old Testament, there was never a blanket ban on non-believers.
No.
The punishment for Jews would be if somebody was teaching the other Jews or the other Israelites to follow other gods. Mm-hmm. But there's no ban on non-Jews being in the land. In fact, if you read Deuteronomy 31, it says in verse 10, Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men and women and little ones, and the sojourner or foreigner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God.
Right. So I think just to also add to that, the standard is harder for Jews, right, in that area. Like there are laws that apply to them, and it's the same with us Christians. Judgment begins. The theme is judgment begins with the house of God, right? So if you are a Christian nation and you call upon the name of the Lord, right? It's not like saying there's a covenant, but if you commit like iniquity and injustice, you provoke God to act on behalf of the people you're oppressing, and that God will deal with his children with discipline, right? So, yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
So you take that, there's an expectation in the Old Testament. There are going to be non-Jews, non-believers, people of different religious groups living in the land of Israel back then. And the way the New Testament trains us is not with an expectation that we're going to be segregated from the rest of the world, but that we're going to be living side by side with unbelievers for our entire reality. And the way we're told to treat those people is to welcome them, to show hospitality to them, to love them, just like the Jews are supposed to as well. So I think you can have a nation which is trying to honor God with your laws, but it's not bringing the kingdom of heaven down on earth. The mission of the kingdom of heaven right now, expressed through the church, not the state, is there to be able to proclaim the love and mercy of God to people who don't know yet, and welcoming strangers and foreigners into your country who believe differently is biblical.
So let me ask you this, and I ask both of you. So do you think that the principle lies within the separation of state and church that allows, because if you take church and state as one unit, then we have seen, you give an example of Puritans. What I know a little bit of history, when Puritans came in the United States, they were pretty secluded societies, and they didn't like the other societies to settle in. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I read. So please correct me if I am. So that is also a form of having state and religion all together. So is that the principle that state and religion should be different, and that's how it allows all the other religions, or Muslims or Jews or other religions, to come and live side by side?
I'd actually make the argument that the Puritans were some of the key pioneers of the separation between church and state. That's the whole reason they left England, is because you had a state church that they didn't want their consciences bound by.
But they didn't allow people to live in their societies here when they came in, right? They were persecuting Catholics when they tried to come in, live their society.
This is the thing, right? This is the part of American history that gets glossed over a lot, because we focus on the separation from Britain and all the events of 1776. Each one of the states, the colonies at that point, was founded by a different religious group, right? So, Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, right? Like I think Maryland was, I can't remember, but different states were founded by Catholics, and some were founded by Puritans, right? So the idea is that they didn't get along. But the truth is, when they were forming a system of government, there was this idea written into it that we are all brothers and sisters in Christ, right? So we're all connected by Christ. Because they were all Christians. They were all coming from a Christian standpoint, even though they had disagreements. That being said, if you went into some places, you got chased out, right? Because they didn't, the Catholics didn't want the Protestants living next to them, and so on and so forth. And that has kind of repeated itself all throughout history. Though the enmity between brothers is something that's really hard to, kind of overcome in Christianity. When Jesus comes back, we'll all be one, right? Like we'll all be united under his rule. So that being said, like a Muslim, coming into that context is going to, I feel it, more so. But that's what I was talking about, right? So you were talking about the separation of church and state. And that's where I would tie back in, the principles of the Renaissance and the French Revolution and all that other stuff, where, people started pushing back on this idea. So you could have a state religion, but it wasn't necessarily in control of the civic apparatus.
Yeah, well, so Jesus himself says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting.
Right.
So the Bible teaches that both the state and the church are created to serve God, but they're there to serve God in different realms, which means there's going to be very specific things the state does, which are about matters of justice, money, borders, things like that. And there are things the church deals with, which are going to be people's souls, ultimately. And that line is not like a completely stark line, but I would say the line is less blurry than the Islamic line is when we look into the Islamic source materials.